Remember the feeling back in 2016? That sense of uncertainty washing over international relations, particularly for Canada, as our closest neighbor and largest trading partner elected a president who promised disruption. Fast forward, and the prospect of a second Donald Trump presidency, a potential Trump 2.0, isn't just a rerun. It's a sequel potentially laden with even more complex plot twists for Canada's place on the world stage, specifically within the influential Group of Seven, or G7. It's easy to recall the strained handshakes, the tariff threats that hit close to home for industries from aluminum to automobiles, and the general feeling that the predictable rhythms of diplomacy had been replaced by improvisational theater. But this time, the implications feel different, perhaps deeper. It's not just about navigating unpredictable tweets or sudden policy shifts. It's about understanding how a potentially more focused, experienced, and perhaps less constrained Trump administration could fundamentally reshape the dynamics of the G7, forcing Canada to reevaluate its strategies, alliances, and very definition of influence within this critical form of leading industrialized democracies. This isn't merely a question of managing bilateral relations. It's about Canada's role in a potentially reconfigured global order, starting with the club that has long symbolized Western economic and political cooperation. The G7, historically, has been a cornerstone of Canadian foreign policy, a platform where Canada, despite its relative size compared to giants like the US, Germany, or Japan, could punch above its weight, championing multilateralism, rules-based international order, and progressive values on issues ranging from climate change to global health and development assistance. It provided a predictable framework, a forum for consensus building among like-minded nations. However, the first Trump presidency already tested the limits of that consensus, most visibly during the tumultuous 2018 G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec, which ended with the then U.S. president retracting his endorsement of the joint communiqué. A potential Trump 2.0 raises the stakes considerably. Would the core tenets of G7 cooperation, shared democratic values, commitment to free trade, collective security approaches, and coordinated action on global challenges withstand a renewed America First doctrine? This doctrine might prioritize bilateral deals over multilateral agreements, question long-standing security commitments, and potentially view traditional allies more as economic competitors than partners. For Canada, deeply integrated economically and sharing the world's longest undefended border with the U.S., the shockwaves could be immediate and profound, forcing Ottawa to navigate a landscape where its primary ally might also be the primary source of disruption within its most important multilateral grouping. This exploration isn't about predicting the future with certainty. Crystal balls are notoriously unreliable in geopolitics. Instead, it's about preparing for possibilities, understanding the potential pressures, and analyzing how Canada might adapt its posture within the G7 should a second Trump administration come to pass. What tools does Canada possess to maintain its influence? How might its relationships with other G7 partners, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the European Union, evolve as they too grapple with a potentially isolationist or transactional Washington? Could Canada find itself acting as a bridge, or would it be forced to choose sides in a fractured alliance? The questions are complex and carry significant weight for Canadian prosperity, security, and international standing. We need to move beyond the headlines and delve into the structural shifts that could occur within the G7 framework itself. This involves looking at how trade negotiations might change, how defense and security cooperation could be reevaluated, the potential divergence on climate action policies, and even the fundamental purpose and cohesion of the G7 in an era potentially defined by great power competition and a challenge to the very idea of a unified West. This journey requires us to examine the lessons learned from 2017 to 2021, but also to recognize that Trump 2.0 wouldn't be a simple repeat performance. It could represent a more calculated and potentially more enduring shift in American foreign policy, demanding a sophisticated and strategic response from Canada within the G7 context. To truly grasp the potential magnitude of a shift under a second Trump presidency, it helps to rewind and understand just what the G7 is, and perhaps more importantly, what it wasn't meant to be initially. Its origins lie not in grand geopolitical strategy meetings, but in the smoky haze of economic crisis during the mid-1970s. Think stagflation, soaring energy prices following the OPEC oil embargo, and a general sense that the post-war Bretton Woods system was sputtering. Faced with these shared challenges, finance ministers from the major Western economies started meeting informally, a gathering sometimes dubbed the Library Group. This wasn't about redrawing maps or forging military alliances. It was about crisis management, trying to get their collective economic house in order. The first formal summit, convened at Rambouillet, France in 1975, brought together the leaders of France, West Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the original G6. Their primary focus? Stabilizing exchange rates, tackling inflation, and promoting economic growth. It was pragmatic, relatively low-key, and centered squarely on shared economic vulnerabilities. There was an implicit understanding that cooperation, or at least coordination, was essential to prevent a global economic slide. Now, where did Canada fit into this picture? Initially, we weren't at that Rambouillet table. Canada's invitation came the following year for the 1976 summit in Puerto Rico, transforming the G6 into the G7. Why the inclusion? Several factors played a role. Canada's economy, while smaller than the US or Germany, was significant and deeply intertwined with the other members, particularly the United States. Furthermore, Canada was seen as a reliable partner, a stable democracy sharing similar values, and a nation committed to international cooperation, a perspective championed notably by then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Joining the G7 was a recognition of Canada's economic stature and its role as a key player in the industrialized world. It granted Canada a seat at the top table, a forum to voice its interests and concerns directly with the leaders of the world's most powerful economies. This wasn't merely symbolic. It provided tangible influence on global economic policy direction, trade negotiations, and financial stability discussions, issues profoundly impacting Canadian jobs and prosperity back home. Think about it. Gaining access to this exclusive club offered a unique channel for middle power diplomacy. Over the subsequent decades, the G7's agenda naturally broadened beyond purely macroeconomic coordination. While economic issues remained central, the summits evolved to tackle pressing political and security matters, East-West relations during the Cold War, counterterrorism, regional conflicts, nuclear non-proliferation, and eventually, global health crises and climate change. The group became a steering committee, albeit an informal one, for addressing a wider array of global challenges. Russia's inclusion in 1997, forming the G8, marked a significant attempt to integrate a post-Soviet Russia into this cooperative framework, though this was later suspended following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, reverting the group back to the G7 format. Throughout this evolution, Canada consistently positioned itself as a constructive partner, often acting as a bridge builder, a strong advocate for multilateral institutions, international law, and development assistance. Its role wasn't typically that of a disruptive force, but rather a voice for consensus, stability, and adherence to shared norms, a stark contrast to the potential dynamic foreshadowed by the America First approach. Understanding this history is crucial because it highlights the foundational premise of the G7, cooperation among like-minded nations facing shared problems. It began as an economic necessity and evolved into a broader political alignment based on common values and a belief in collective action. Canada's participation was predicated on this model. Consequently, a U.S. administration under Trump 2.0, potentially prioritizing unilateral action, questioning the value of traditional alliances, and viewing international relations primarily through a transactional lens, doesn't just challenge current policies. It strikes at the very historical roots and established modus operandi of the G7. It forces us to ask whether a forum built on presumed consensus and shared values can effectively function when its most powerful member might operate under a fundamentally different rulebook. This historical context isn't just background noise, it's the baseline against which the potential tremors of a Trump 2.0 presidency must be measured, particularly for a nation like Canada, whose influence within the group has always relied heavily on the principles of collaboration and shared purpose. Reflecting on the path we've navigated thus far, from the initial jolt of potential disruption to the bedrock of the G7's origins and Canada's traditional footing within it, a complex picture emerges. It's akin to watching the familiar currents of a wide river suddenly encountering new, powerful crosswinds. The surface patterns change, the old navigational charts become less reliable, and the destination, while still visible, requires a different kind of steering. The potential recalibration emanating from Washington isn't merely a bilateral squall for Canada to weather. It sends ripples across the entire G7 pond, potentially altering the very chemistry of cooperation that has defined the group for decades. We've seen how Canada carved out its space within this forum, leveraging a commitment to multilateralism and shared principles that now seem poised for a stress test unlike any seen since the group's inception amidst the economic anxieties of the 1970s. The interplay between a potentially inward-looking American posture and the outward-facing challenges demanding collective G7 action, think climate instability, technological governance, or global economic resilience, creates a palpable tension. Drawing these strands together, we perceive not just isolated challenges, a trade dispute here, a diplomatic disagreement there, but the possibility of a more fundamental realignment within this crucial international body. The historical context underscores how much the G7 relied on a certain predictability, a shared lexicon of diplomatic engagement even amidst disagreements. Introducing a significantly different dialect, one prioritizing transactional gains over long-term alliance cohesion, forces every other member, Canada included, to reconsider their own phrasebook. It's as if the established rules of engagement for this particular summit table are being subtly rewritten, demanding not just passive listening, but active interpretation and strategic response. The core mechanisms we explored, the very reasons Canada valued its G7 seat, influencing global economic norms, coordinating on security, championing specific values, face potential reconfiguration if the group's center of gravity shifts dramatically or if its internal cohesion weakens. This isn't about assigning blame or predicting doom. Rather, it's about recognizing the tectonic plates potentially moving beneath the surface of international diplomacy. Consequently, the strategic calculus for Ottawa becomes significantly more intricate. It moves beyond managing a single, albeit crucial, relationship. Consider how this complex dynamic forces a reevaluation of partnerships within the G7 itself. Might Canada find itself needing to forge even tighter bonds with European partners or Japan, creating counterweights or alternative pathways for cooperation, should the traditional alignment with Washington become less dependable? This potential fragmentation, or at least reformulation, of alliances within the group adds another layer to Canada's challenge. The comfortable assumptions underpinning Canada's G7 strategy, reliance on American leadership on certain files, the ability to build consensus through quiet diplomacy, the shared commitment to certain global public goods, might no longer hold firm. Preparing for this potential future isn't merely about contingency planning. It involves a deeper reflection on Canada's sources of influence and how they might be deployed in a less predictable, potentially more competitive G7 environment. As we pivot towards a final reflection, the weight of these interconnected factors, historical precedent, potential policy shifts, evolving internal G7 dynamics, and enduring global challenges, settles in, prompting a crucial consideration of what Canada's role could, or perhaps must, become. Ultimately, contemplating a potential second Trump administration through the lens of Canada's G7 role isn't just an exercise in geopolitical forecasting. It's an invitation to reflect on the very nature of Canadian influence in a world where the established signposts seem increasingly unsteady. The journey we've taken highlights that Canada's position within this influential group was never static, but evolved alongside global economic tides and shifting political landscapes. Yet, the potential disruption under discussion feels qualitatively different, challenging the foundational assumptions of cooperative multilateralism that have long underpinned Canada's approach. It forces a move beyond comfortable diplomatic routines and demands a sharper, more adaptable, strategic vision. The question ceases to be merely how Canada engages within the G7, but what Canada fundamentally seeks to achieve and protect through its participation in such forums when the ground beneath seems to be shifting. It compels a clear-eyed assessment of national interests, core values, and the most effective means of advancing them in an environment potentially less receptive to traditional Canadian diplomatic strengths. This potential future doesn't necessarily signal an inevitable decline in Canadian relevance, but rather underscores the imperative for strategic agility and resourcefulness. Think of it less as navigating a predictable current and more like sailing in variable winds. Success depends not just on the sturdiness of the vessel, but on the crew's skill in reading the conditions, adjusting the sails, and perhaps seeking out new harbors or alliances when familiar routes become treacherous. Canada might need to become even more adept at building coalitions within the G7, perhaps strengthening ties with European partners and Japan to champion shared priorities, whether on climate action, digital governance, or upholding international norms. It might also necessitate looking beyond the G7, diversifying partnerships and investing more heavily in other multilateral arenas to ensure Canadian interests have multiple avenues for expression and advancement. The premium shifts towards proactive diplomacy, anticipating friction points and identifying areas where Canadian leadership or niche expertise can still make a tangible difference, even if the broader consensus within the group proves elusive. Furthermore, this scenario pushes Canadians themselves to consider what role they want their country to play internationally. Does Canada double down on its commitment to multilateralism, even when it becomes more difficult, acting as a steadfast defender of the rules-based order? Or does it adopt a more pragmatic, interest-driven approach, mirroring the potential transactionalism elsewhere? There isn't necessarily a single correct answer, but the conversation itself is vital. A potential Trump 2.0 acts as a powerful catalyst, forcing a national dialogue about foreign policy priorities and the resources required to achieve them effectively. It's a reminder that international influence isn't solely derived from economic size or military might, but also from consistency, reliability, strategic partnerships, and the ability to offer constructive solutions to shared problems, qualities Canada must continue to cultivate and deploy intelligently. In the end, the true test presented by this potential geopolitical shift lies not just in navigating the immediate diplomatic or economic hurdles, but in Canada's capacity for strategic foresight and adaptation over the longer term. It's about ensuring that Canadian foreign policy remains anchored in core values, yet flexible enough to operate effectively within a potentially transformed global landscape, particularly within crucial forums like the G7. Perhaps the most enduring takeaway is the reinforcement of an old truth. In international relations, nothing is permanent except change itself. The challenge, and indeed the opportunity for Canada, is to meet this potential wave of change not with trepidation, but with a clear sense of purpose, a willingness to innovate in its diplomatic craft, and a renewed commitment to forging the relationships necessary to secure its interests and contribute meaningfully to a stable and prosperous world. The real work, perhaps, lies in continuously defining and asserting Canada's unique value proposition on a stage where the script is constantly being revised.